Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? I'm Scott King, and it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Darcy Distinguished Lecturer. But first, I'm going to tell you that the Darcy Lecture started back in 1986. And in the past 33 years, this Darcy Lectureship has grown to be a global phenomenon. Initially initiated to be 8 to 10 lectures in the United States. It's now been, we've asked lecturers to take on more and more, it seems, in response to invitations, where lectures have gone across Canada, across the United States, Europe, Australia, South Africa. In fact, we've had at least several lecturers from outside the United States, several from Canada, 2 from Europe, and as you'll hear today, our second one from Australia. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce John Doherty, a past winner of the M. King Hubbard Award for NGWA, and this year's Darcy Distinguished Lecturer, and I'll let him tell you a bit more about himself.
Thank you. Firstly, please forgive my voice. I had a cold a little while ago and it hasn't quite recovered yet. But I'm not infectious, so you won't catch what I've got just from listening to the words. Also, there are some people here that I have heard this talk before, and my suggestion to you is to leave immediately. So just a couple of things about myself. I'm self-employed. I work for myself. I'm also the software developer. I'm developer of PEST, which is used throughout the groundwater industry for calibration and uncertainty analysis. And that's about all. And I also am affiliated with universities too, so that I've got a foot in both the consulting and academic camp. And that's probably all you need to know about me. Just a word about the sponsors. So maybe a few seconds spent in silence contemplating the generosity of the sponsors. Okay, when you're finished, good. And now on to the subject. So what I want to talk about, and I'm coming here as a perspective as a consultant, and some of the jobs that I'm involved in you can see on the slides there. That I do a lot of work in mining in Australia, in New Zealand. Nitrates in groundwater is a big issue. Over here I do work in remediation, water sustainability everywhere, and that slide down at the bottom right. That's a big issue in Australia that I'm working on, is the impact of coal bed methane extraction on other aquifers. And in answer to all those questions, to pursue answers, to pursue management of all those issues, we do a lot of groundwater modelling. And the subject of my talk is that while I think groundwater modelling is a really important tool, that the potential it has for helping us to manage groundwater systems perhaps hasn't quite been tapped to the extent that it could. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm not sure that we as an industry have fully learned how to use groundwater models yet. I think we know how to misuse them, and we know how to spend lots of money misusing them, but I'm not sure we know how to spend maybe less money using them properly. And that's the subject I want to address. So when it comes to advice on how we should model, there's no shortage of advice. And a lot of that advice has been given in response to a sense that there's a lot of people out there who are fairly sceptical about groundwater modelling. And I have to admit that I fall into that category myself. And there have been quite a lot of crimes against humanity committed on a regular basis by groundwater modelers, so I don't blame anyone for being sceptical. In Australia, we have these things called the Australian Groundwater Modelling Guidelines. I was a little bit of part of that document on the right there that would support the Sigma legislation in California. And all of the documents, all the guidance we're given kind of follows the same theme. Now, it makes sense up to a point, but I think there are some nuances of that theme which are taking us in somewhat the wrong direction. So the idea is we start off with a conceptual model, a figment of geological imagination, and geologists have very ripe imaginations. We then drape over that figment of geological imagination a numerical grid, and we start building the model. And there's always a bias when we start building the model towards complexity, because as we build a model, we're worried that other people are going to look at our model, reviewers are going to look at our model, and reviewers are paid to be obnoxious, and there's one rule of human nature that's always followed: when someone's paid to be obnoxious, they will always rise to the occasion. And the low-hanging fruit is the model's not complex enough. And the thing about groundwater models is there is no high-hanging fruit. All the fruit hangs very low. And if you want to criticise someone's model, which is easy to do, it's missing this or it's missing that, or it hasn't got enough layers, or it's not complex enough. So models tend to be very complex, and hence the time to calibrate those models arrives just as the budgets run out, because so much effort has been made into making it more complex. So then a halfway decent fit is got between the calibration data set and the model. The model is declared as fit for purpose when the fit is good enough to get away with, and you come up with some RMS value that doesn't embarrass you. So the model is declared as fit for purpose, and oh, by the way, now that we've got the ability to say what's going to happen to a system, we then do a little bit of uncertainty analysis at the end of this process. Why? Because uncertainty analysis has become very cool these days. Not a lot of people know how to do uncertainty analysis, and even less people know what to do with the outcomes of uncertainty analysis, but we all do a bit of uncertainty analysis these days. And indeed, the guidance documents have been modified to suggest that we do it. So modifications to the Australian guidelines tell us, wax lyrical about the importance of uncertainty analysis, with very little about how to do it. And indeed, Step 9 of the best management practice in the best management practice document for the SWIFT legislation stresses the importance of uncertainty analysis, closely following 8 steps that make it almost impossible to do uncertainty analysis. The importance of uncertainty analysis is stressed as Step 9. But still, even though uncertainty analysis is becoming very cool, it's still not cool for everyone. So here's a couple of recent quotes that I've heard. The top one, said by someone who's fairly well known in the industry, whose name I won't mention, sort of stating that if we build a model well enough, complex enough, it doesn't need uncertainty analysis because the partial differential equations take care of themselves. And on that bottom one, that's an email I got just a couple of weeks ago by a consulting company that sells very complex software, and doesn't imply, it states openly that if you use this software, you'll be able to solve any and all problems associated with groundwater. Now, what does solve mean? I guess it means that if you use the software, you get the answer at the back of the book. But there's no theoretical basis for that. In fact, if there was a theoretical basis for that idea, it'd be it'd come from text, in a deep text such as Harry Potter, because mathematical texts don't tell you that you can get the right answer through using a model. What mathematical texts tell you is something entirely different, which we'll touch on in a moment. So I think we've got some problems in the way we use models in our industry, and I'll just itemise some of them now. And I think these are all based on misconceptions about what modelling can and can't achieve. So the problem one is that just because we've calibrated a model, that doesn't mean we're going to get the right answer. And in fact, base statistics 101 tells you that a model can never tell you what will happen in the future. It'll only tell you what won't happen in the future. And between the upper and lower bounds of what won't happen, there's an awful lot of room to move. So just to illustrate that, this is a synthetic study done many years ago by a student of mine to show just how wrong a model can be, even though it's perfectly calibrated. And an awful lot of money changes hands in our industry for the calibrated model. So here's a square grid. We've got a water flowing in at the top of the model domain, a fixed head boundary down at the bottom, a particle which winds its way through a heterogeneous hydraulic conductivity field. So the answer at the back of the book is that that's how long it takes for the particle to get there. over 3,000 days. Now, I'm going to make that same prediction with a perfectly calibrated model. I'm going to calibrate that model against 12 heads measured in 12 different wells, calculated by the model itself. I'm going to do everything right when I history match that model. I'm going to fit that data perfectly because there is no noise associated with those measurements. And when I make that prediction, I get it 100% wrong. And the model's perfectly calibrated. Now, does that mean that that's a bad model? Hell no, it doesn't mean it's a bad model. And if we say that just because a model gives a wrong answer, that it's a bad model, we have got entirely the wrong metric. There's no reason why the information content of 12 heads should allow you to make a prediction that depends on detail that is beyond the reach of the information supplied by those 12 heads. The metric for bad model is not that it gives the right answer, because there's no mathematical reason why a groundwater model should give the right answer. The metric for if it's a bad model is if the right answer doesn't lie within the uncertainty limits as quantified by the model. And at the end of the day, a model can and should quantify its own wrongness. And if it doesn't, what's the point? Because it is going to be wrong. And if we're talking about uncertainty, which is what we are, then the final word on history matching is given to us by Bayes' equation. Bayes' equation says we start off with uncertainty. Well, that's those figments of geological imagination that I mentioned a few moments ago. We don't know what's under the ground, we know what's not under the ground, and we sure don't know the detail of what's under the ground, but water is going to exploit that detail and contaminants to go exactly where it wants to go. So, expert knowledge is a random number generator, and that's there on the right-hand side of Bayes' equation. However, not every figment of geological imagination should find its place in a model, only those which allow the model to replicate the past behaviour of the system. That's the second term of Bayes' equation. Bayes' equation says that at the end of the day, there is still uncertainty, a so-called posterior probability distribution associated with any prediction we're going to make. Bayes' equation says we start with uncertainty, we finish with uncertainty, hopefully less than before through assimilating the data that's there in the historical behaviour of the system. Assimilating data, I mean history matching. Okay, so where does the calibrated model fit into this? If Bayes' equation is the last word on what history matching can and can't achieve, where does the calibrated model fit into this? Well, actually, there is no place for the calibrated model in Bayes' equation. So if we're going to replace that with that, one parameter field, and call it a calibrated model, and stick a big invoice on the back of that model and say this is the purveyor of truth, what justification have we got for that? Well, really not much, except there is numerical conveniences in seeking uniqueness. Probability distributions are fairly hot to handle numerically, though it's becoming easier with time. And if we are going to say, here's the calibrated model you're going to use to make important predictions, then we've really only got one excuse for that. And that's if we say that it's not the right answer that I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you an answer whose potential for wrongness has been minimised. It can be shown mathematically, this can be done, and it does give us uniqueness. But it doesn't give us what the decision-making process requires, because why are we modelling? We're modelling because we want to avoid the happening of bad things, our investments going sour, stakeholders getting angry, the environment being destroyed. There's always a bad thing out there on our horizon. And it's not good enough to say, well, this is the minimum error variance prediction made by a calibrated model. We need to know the statistical distance between that bad thing and the prediction. We need to know whether the probability distribution, which we're sitting in the centre of, is like that or like that. And if it's like that, we got a problem. There's a risk associated with what we're doing. Risk is loosely defined as the probability of something going wrong times the cost of something going wrong. And if a groundwater model isn't allowing us to assess risk, how can we say it's supporting decision making? And if it's not assessing uncertainty, how can it assess risk? So it follows that it's a fundamental requirement of decision support modelling that a model accompany any prediction it makes with a quantified margin of uncertainty associated with that prediction so that we can make the decision properly. Problem number 2 is this isn't an easy job. So there are tools available through the PEST suite, through the PEST++ suite. So for example, this is a job I finished recently in south of Georgia, north of Florida. Here's the parameter field associated with layer 3 of the calibrated model. And here's a sample of 500 parameter fields that were part of the deliverable. Each one of those parameter fields calibrates the model just as well as the calibrated parameter field. Each one of them is passable geologically. So when we make a prediction with all of them, and we can draw up a cumulative probability distribution of any prediction we make. So we are doing what should be done by decision support modelling. The problem is, though, that, okay, we can quantify uncertainty up to a point. There's always compromises. The parameter fields that we can wiggle and adjust and allow us to fit the calibration data set to explore uncertainty, they're not quite geologically realistic. They don't represent the kind of figments of geological imagination that modern geostatistical software could. But at this point in time, we can't manipulate those figments of imagination. We have to manipulate parameter fields which are somewhat simplistic in nature. It's better than nothing, but we're not there yet. So what that means is all this is a bit of a compromise, the parameter fields that we use to explore the uncertainty of decision-pertinent predictions. But then modelling is a compromise. And too often I think the fact that it is a compromise is swept under the rug. Of course it's a compromise. It's a hopeless compromise. And that's okay. That doesn't invalidate the role of modelling in decision support. What invalidates the role of modelling in decision support is pretending that it's not a compromise and not compromising the way we need to make its role in decision support as profound as possible. So there's so many things. The difference between reality and a model is huge, and we not only admit that, but embrace it and use it to our advantage. So this is some work that I did a few years ago with some colleagues in the USGS, one of which is in this room, to explore the effect of defects, the fact that a model is defective. And the question is, if you've got a defective model, which any model is, can we calibrate out its defects? How much store we put in that word calibration? And part of that store is the notion we can calibrate out a model's defects. Okay, I'm not going to explain the terms of that equation, but a model can, in principle, quantify how much it can be wrong. And that's an equation that we can use to do that. Except it's not the right equation. The right equation involves terms that are not actually in the model. The right equation involves differences between the model and reality. Parameters that are in reality that are not in the model. Processes that are in reality and are not in the model. And when we calibrate a defective model, we may be able to get a good fit, no problem getting a good fit, but are we then possibly making parameters take on compensatory roles and actually biasing those parameters and some of the predictions which depend on them? So to look at this, I did some work with my colleagues. We looked at this as a model in the south of Florida very briefly. It looks at aquifer storage and recovery. We had the luxury of having a complex model and an even more complex model underneath it, so we could explore the ramifications of those terms. And we can draw graphs like this. And this is a graph. The further you go to the right of that graph, the better the fit you get between model outputs and the calibration data set. Getting a good fit is not a problem. At the left is if you didn't get a fit at all. So there's a sweet point there, and I'd point to that. So we have a sweet point here, which is the place where you get the most out of the data before we overfit. If we add on that, and we can quantify that, we can draw these graphs using utilities from the PEST and PEST++ suites. But what if we take account of those missing terms, which in the only place we can is in a highly synthetic case like I'm talking about, where we had a more complex model behind us. This is the curve. There's the sweet spot. We overfit way back here. There is a point where parameters are taking on compensatory roles for model defects. We are incurring bias in that prediction. Here's another prediction, a prediction that's very different from the data we actually used in the calibration data set. And here, any attempt to fit has actually done more harm than good. And I've seen this graph in other cases as well. It can be shown mathematically that Once we take into account that a model's got defects, everything is suddenly, well, a little bit horrific. We can show that if predictions we make are very similar to what we calibrate against, then any fit's a good fit. Fitting the past allows us to predict the future. That's why machine learning works. If we're making a prediction that's pretty much uninformed by the calibration data set, well, its uncertainty is not going to go down at all by history matching. You saw that before in the first slides I showed. It's those ones in between, and they tend to be the ones that we're required to make most in groundwater modelling. Those predictions for which the information required to make those predictions is a blend of the historical behaviour of the system on the one hand and expert knowledge on the other, poured into receptacles of a model that is always going to be defective. That's the place, that's the danger area where the attempts to reduce the uncertainty of those predictions may at some stage actually increase their bias, that is their uncertainty, in unquantifiable ways. Through the act of trying to reduce uncertainty, we can increase it as parameters take on compensatory roles because of defects in the model. Well, we can't help that. That's just the way it is. We can do some things about it. There are steps that we can take in the way we design the calibration process to mitigate that effect to some extent. It'll never completely go away. It can go away in some ways, sometimes, if we design the calibration process to do it. But the important point here is the link between good parameters and good predictions is broken, and ways to mitigate that effect are always going to be prediction specific. So what works for this prediction won't work for that prediction, and in fact the effect of defects and calibrating defects is prediction specific. So that means that the idea that we can have a model that can make all kinds of predictions is starting to evaporate. We'd like to have a model that can make all kinds of predictions because human nature has always wanted to have crystal balls. Human nature's always wanted to have witch doctors, and in some ways we groundwater modelers are modern day witch doctors. In the olden days, witch doctors would do things like look at the entrails of chickens and see the future from the patterns of the entrails of the chickens, or tea leaves. We look at groundwater models. I've seen a lot of groundwater models, and I'd put my bet on the entrails of chickens any day than on half the groundwater models that I've seen. Until we start to mend our ways to do this thing a little bit better. So, problem number 4, well, we haven't mended our ways yet. In fact, we've got a narrative in our industry which takes us into fairyland, telling us again and again that if we follow this simple 5-step process, starting from the conceptual model and doing all those other things, we'll end up with something that can make any kind of prediction. It is a model after all, and most importantly, it's an expensive model after all, and it's another rule of human nature that the more money you've paid for anything, the less likely you are to criticise it, the less you want to criticise it, the more you want to maintain your belief that you've spent your money wisely. And that'll be the biggest impediment to admitting that maybe, just maybe, there's a better way to do things. And the fact that we're spending so much money maintaining the status quo has a lot to do, I think, with the fact that we're not questioning the status quo. So, and our graphical user interfaces tend to encapsulate this narrative. Data assimilation, calibration, uncertainty analysis is just an afterthought. So, the consequences, we follow the narrative and we come up with big, ugly beasts of models that are meant to predict everything. And if there's one thing I found, that a model that is intended to make all kinds of predictions is actually good at making no kinds of predictions. The only thing that you can be sure of is that it'll spend half its time in numerical hospital, and that it'll cost a lot of money to buy. And that people are pulling their hair out trying to get it to converge. So, is there a better way to do things? Well, I've got half an hour to explain that. Yes, I think there is a better way to do things. So, firstly, we've got to abandon the idea that we can actually simulate what happens under the ground. We can process data that gives us information about what's under the ground, and there's no better way to process that data with a model, and the model's going to be defective, but it's still the best way we have of processing data that can help us quantify and reduce the uncertainties of important predictions. But let's get over the idea that we're actually simulating what's happening under the ground, because obviously we're not. And let's also get over the idea that modelling should be some kind of like representational art. Often the best art is the abstract art. The art that includes what needs to be included and that leaves out what should be left out, leaves out the stuff that's an impediment to our understanding. And one problem with great big complex models is that it's got probably more impediments to our understanding than things which aid our understanding. So maybe abstraction, as is done in abstract art, is something we should consider more of in groundwater modelling, because after all, even the most complex model is abstract. Why not embrace abstraction and turn it to our benefit rather than turning it against us? So what's essential in a model? Well, anything that allows us to quantify and reduce the uncertainties of decision-critical predictions, obviously. And what's non-essential? Anything that gets in the way, obviously. So if we take that as good precepts, then straight away the idea of long, unstable, fast-running models as actually being decision support tools starts to evaporate. So how do we do this then? Well, firstly, we say, what am I doing here when I'm building a model to support decisions? Well, what's the fundamental aspect of making a decision? You ask, what can go wrong? Any decision, that's the first thing you ask before you actually take that decision. If I do this, what can go wrong? Well, so if modelling then doesn't answer that question or attempt to answer that question, it's not supporting decisions. If every step in its design and its implementation and history matching doesn't address that question, it's not supporting decisions. So what that means is that in most decision-making contexts, there's a null hypothesis hanging over our heads that something will go wrong. And the model's job is to test that hypothesis. Now, I've got to be careful here because I'm starting to sound awfully like I'm talking to you about the scientific method. And perhaps, just perhaps, we modelers may begin to think of ourselves as actually scientists rather than witch doctors and adopt the scientific method, and perhaps then our scientific tool, our instrument, can be the groundwater model. So let's talk more about the scientific method. The scientific method says you can test a hypothesis. You can never accept a hypothesis uniquely. But you can reject a hypothesis. There's an asymmetry of knowledge implied in the scientific method. So can a model then be used to test hypotheses, to implement the scientific method? Well, if there's something we don't want to happen, if I want to do this and I don't want that to happen, I can reject the hypothesis that will happen if I can demonstrate its incompatibility with one or more of three things. One is how the system operates. Well, we got a simulator, that's the model. The second is the historical behaviour of the system. Well, we're history matching. The third is what expert knowledge knows about the site that we're working at. Well, that's expert knowledge, and that's there in Bayes' equation. And that's there in the model through the parameters and the design that we give it. So the model, in theory, has everything it needs to be a scientific instrument. All it needs is for us to deploy it as a scientific instrument. So we've got to then shift our focus from simulating reality, because we're not, to actually being scientists. And in the decision-making process, the wherewithal to be scientists is right there for us. There's hypotheses we need to test so that decisions can be made. If we can't reject hypothesis that a certain thing will happen, far, far better to know it than to proceed in the illusion that it won't happen. And that'll only happen if you actually use the model, embrace the fact that any predictions made by it are uncertain, and use that model as a scientific instrument in a hypothesis testing capacity when the hypotheses are right there in front of our nose. So you could say, why haven't we been doing this all the time? And I don't know, because it's more easy to believe that we can predict the future, which has been one of the flaws of human nature since human nature was human nature. So if we are going to adopt the scientific method, we now have some metrics for decision support modelling. Metrics which I haven't seen in any documents that tell us how to model anywhere. And they're simple metrics, and it's not that hard. First metric is failure. if I reject a hypothesis, and I shouldn't, that's a type 2 statistical error, and that's failure. That's the sword of Damocles hanging over my head. If I say that won't happen, and it does, I failed. And every step I take in building the model and in reporting the model and justifying to the reviewers how I built that model should be a justification why these steps, even though I've had to be abstract somewhat to get the best out of the model, to assimilate the data, to quantify uncertainty, everything I do, I should justify why I am not failing in taking those steps. We've also got a metric for simplification, for abstraction. We need to be more abstract so our models can run faster. We can assimilate data. We can quantify uncertainty because that's numerically intensive. But whenever I quantify uncertainty, I've got to have conservative uncertainty limits. Otherwise, I commit a type 2 statistical error. So we've got a fundamental specification for any abstraction we do, and modelling is all about abstraction, and let's embrace it rather than eschew it. But of course, I can say, okay, I can make a model quite simple and then add on an engineering safety margin. And it can be so broad that I can't reject any hypotheses. Well, that gets me out of the type 2 statistical error, but it's pretty useless and I'm not helping anyone. But there then is our spectrum of where we sit as groundwater modelers. Somewhere between useless and failure is that spectrum on which we as modelers have to place our miserable existences. And the thing about modelling is there is no success. And this might sound kind of pessimistic, but it's just embracing reality. We can't simulate what happens under the ground. We can process data. Our attempts to simulate are very poor. Our attempts to process and assimilate data can be very good. And what we do that with is not going to be a replica of the real thing. It's going to be something that can simulate enough of the real thing to allow us to simulate data that's pertinent to a prediction, not any and every prediction, a prediction, because if we had to assimilate all information pertaining to all predictions, well, it would be an impossibly complex, useless model. So we have to embrace the fact that we place ourselves along a fairly sorry spectrum, but a useful spectrum, and where we put ourselves on that spectrum will depend on a lot of things, the budget, the time, our skill level, whatever. But let's not deny the fact that everything is a compromise. Let's embrace that compromise and turn it to our advantage using a philosophy that works rather than a philosophy which has let us down time and time again. So, coming back to the synthetic example, I could make a prediction, not quantify uncertainty, failure. I could make a prediction, then quantify the uncertainty. I've done the right thing for decision support modelling. I could use a simplistic parameterization scheme. I could calibrate that model against those 12 heads, and then make that particle time prediction. Failure, because that prediction depends on a lot more detail that can be represented in the simplistic parameterization scheme. I could use that simplistic parameterization scheme to explore worst-case scenarios. I'd have a demonstrably conservative uncertainty limits. If I can reject a hypothesis with demonstrably conservative uncertainty limits, it's rejected. So that's maybe good modelling practice. I can calibrate against those 12 heads and predict what the future head will be under a different recharge regime using a simplistic parameterization scheme. That'll work because it's a different prediction, and that prediction does not depend on the detail that the particle time prediction depends on. So once again, the prediction specificity of all this is very manifest in these examples. Why then do we need to get more complex when we're building a model? Because it looks better, because it'll please reviewers, because people will continue the illusion that we can actually simulate what happens under the ground, that it'll impress a judge or a jury because we can build a more complex model. All these reasons are a justification on an everyday basis for excessive model complexity. None of them adopt the chain of logic that I think I'm trying to set out here. And if it's not a chain of logic, someone tell me where I'm going wrong. If we're going to add complexity to a model, it's because we can provide, with that complexity, more receptacles for information that allows us to quantify and reduce the uncertainty of a specific prediction. That can be the only justification for that complexity, quantification and reduction of uncertainty. And if we've got to be conservative, if we're simple, then complexity allows us to be less conservative, and the complex model gives us the receptacles to quantify and reduce the uncertainty of predictions about things we care about. So, but there's a catch here. If we are going to do that, if we are going to reduce uncertainty, again coming back to Bayes' equation, reducing uncertainty means and quantifying uncertainty means we've got to run that model lots of times. We've got to run it, for example, using something like the members of the PEST or PEST++ suites. We've got to run the model to build up predictive histograms and to explore the different possibilities of what can happen given all that we know. And that means that the model just on its own, especially in decision support, really it's like walking on, well, it can't exist on its own. Because if decision support requires quantification of uncertainty and reduction of uncertainty, that simulator is part of a suite of numerical tools. And some of those numerical tools need to run that model many times to history match, to quantify uncertainty. The model is just one part of a comprehensive numerical toolbox and no more or less important than any other part of it. So the idea that here's the model, here's the deliverable, you build the model, then you build the model, you pay the bill, often the taxpayer, you use the model, separating the model builder from the model user, making model a noun and not a verb, turning it into a thing and not a process of decision-specific data abstraction done in conjunction with software that knows how to do that. If we're not talking about models like that, and if models aren't used with dancing partners that can allow models to live up to their decision support potential, then we're not using models properly. And again, perhaps we should consider that models should be a verb, not a noun, a process and not a deliverable, and then it can start to fulfill its decision support potential. So how complex should a model be if it's going to be part of this dance? Well, if it can't dance, it's too complex. Because if it can't dance, it can't assimilate information, it can't quantify uncertainty, it can't work out risk, it can't reduce uncertainty. How simple should it be? Well, if there's a hypothesis here that we'd like to be able to reject, but we can't because we haven't assimilated the data that we've paid so much for, then it's too simple. Now, most complex models that I see today are actually simple models in disguise because they can't assimilate data either. And if they can't assimilate data, quantify and reduce uncertainty, if they say they give the right answer but haven't got the capability to quantify how much they're wrong, then what is the use of that model regardless of its cost? And really, it's just a simple model in disguise. And if you're going to be that wrong, and how wrong you're going to be is set by the data, not by the complexity of the model, why not be that wrong for $10 rather than $10,000 or $100,000? And a lot of models are very expensive, simple models in disguise that have no ability whatever to quantify how much they may be wrong and what is the good of such a model, especially now that the technology is available to do things differently. So, decision support modelling revisited. I think we can do better than that. And we sure as hell can do better than that. So perhaps we should say, let's start from the problem and work backwards. What's the thing that I don't want to happen when I manage the system? If I do this, what hypothesis would I like to reject? Then you say, well, where is the information? The information we've often paid dearly for. Where is the information that may allow, that I can assimilate, that may allow me to test that hypothesis and maybe reject it or demonstrate that it can't be rejected so I can live in the shadow of risk but know that that's exactly what I'm doing. So where is that information? How can I then design the modelling process to assimilate that information that's pertinent to that prediction? How can I design the model so it can assimilate that data, is sleek and fast and prediction specific, tuned to that prediction, because you can't build a model that's tuned to every prediction. It has to be tuned to a prediction. Otherwise, it becomes hugely complicated, can't dance, numerically unstable, does not serve the decision-making process. So then we build a model that can dance, and quantification of uncertainty is just an outcome of that dance. So, and if we've got many different predictions to make, then maybe we need to build many different models. And I would suggest that that'll actually be a cheaper alternative than what we're doing now, the great big complex model that's not particularly good at anything. A suite of simpler models that can assimilate decision-specific data will probably be a cheaper alternative, and an alternative that modelers and stakeholders can get their head around rather than the monstrosities that we're coming up with today. Step number 9 here, maybe that should come right up to step number 1 or 2. What is the prediction that we're interested in? How am I going to quantify and reduce its uncertainty? Then the rest of the model design and specification process comes. What will improve the way we model? Well, what I've been saying, modelling should be a verb, not a noun. It should be enabled by strategic abstraction. And the trouble with being simple is, and it's this big problem, to be simple means you've got to know what you're doing. Complexity is the refuge of the ignorant. And that's probably why there's so much complexity around. But if you know what you're doing, you can understand the system, you can do the abstraction that's necessary to allow you to assimilate data in which so much has been invested to quantify, reduce the uncertainties of predictions that matter, and then place the decision-making process in our industry where it is in every other industry, where it lives or dies by its ability to assess the risk of what we're about to do before we actually do it. And that's the end of the talk.
We do have some time for some questions if folks want to give John some pointed questions. We've certainly got some pointed advice, so let's hear it.
The questions don't have to be pointed. Surely someone wants to argue with me. Steve. Well, I think more than ever. 30 years ago, before we had all these computers at our disposal, and we had to do our what is the role, as we move into the future with bigger machines and better machine learning algorithms, what is the role of the human being? Well, I'd say it's the same role that the human being had 30 years ago before we had all those things. 30 years ago, when all we had was slide rules, you really had to know what you were doing. You had to be able to cut through all the detail to what's the detail that matters and what's the detail I can dispense with, then allow me to make those calculations with what were at the time fairly primitive calculation devices. Now we've got a lot more powerful calculation devices, and we can do a lot more things. We can quantify uncertainty, we can reduce uncertainty, but that human element of cutting through all the stuff that doesn't matter, I think is going to be as important as ever, because we're dealing with the environment here. We're not modelling the wings of aircraft where we know those properties exactly. We're dealing with media whose properties vary over orders of magnitude. There's going to be so much difficulties and we're never going to get it right. The human element is more important than ever in the sort of modelling we're doing. As someone once said, this is not rocket science. Rocket science is easy. What we're doing is a lot harder because at least you know the properties of every element of that rocket and all the fuel that it uses. We know the properties of virtually nothing, and common sense is going to always be our biggest guide in what we do and how we do it. So human beings are here to stay, I think. Or well, unless we mess up the environment even more, but then we won't have computers either.
We're in a position now where regulatory and management agencies
That's a good question. That's probably more about human nature than science. And you're right, you know, there's a really good rule of thumb. The less you know about modelling, the more faith you have in it. And it's also true, I think, that there is a lot of pressure on us, particularly in situations of conflict, to say that I've got the right answer here. But that may be of short-term benefit, but not of long-term benefit. Yes, I think acknowledging and that we don't know the answer at the back of the book, but that we can process data. It will mean that we are going to have to make decisions facing the possibility that things could go wrong, and not under the illusion that they won't. And that means a couple of things. Firstly, we're going to have to be a little bit more mature individuals than we are now. And what I see, as you're suggesting, is greater and greater polarisation, with people having less and less tolerance for any possibility of things going wrong. Well, the fact is some of them will go wrong. So it does mean that we have to be a little bit more logical than we are now. But also, if we can quantify that things can go wrong, we can quantify how they can go wrong, and that gives us the ability to install better monitoring networks and better management regimens that allow us to respond to maybe earlier to the possibility of failure as arises from information from that monitoring network through our ability to design that network better. So there's pluses and negatives here, but I think in the end, you know, I understand what you're saying perfectly, and I understand the pressures, but in the end, well, doesn't it come back to, are we scientists or are we not? And if we're scientists, do we perpetuate an illusion? There's plenty of illusions. I notice all the ads for illusionists around this town. You know, do we keep modelling in Las Vegas, or do we take it to some place and speak the truth? Because I don't know how the future's going to work out, but if we don't speak the truth, the chances of it working out well are somewhat diminished, and we're partly responsible for it. So that's a philosophical answer to a philosophical question. Now, you tell me if I didn't understand the question. So you're doing a lot of 3D. Did you say resistivity or seismic? Okay, and you're saying that the models can't incorporate all that detail. And you're a geophysicist? Well, I used to be a geophysicist, you know. And I do know that non-uniqueness happens a little bit in geophysics too. And that sometimes sometimes the truths which you give us aren't necessarily quite as true as they're sold to be. But nevertheless, our ability to acquire huge amounts of information, true, we're overwhelmed with information. And I don't know the answer to that question. I guess I would ask, how relevant is that information to a prediction? And I was involved in a job recently, in this country actually, where I think a few million had been invested in geophysics. Yes, there's a lot of information there, and people kind of felt, you know, we've got to do something with this, but in the end, if water levels are going down, for example, as they were in this area, how much information do you need to know that I need to pump less? So sometimes that information is going to be of useful, particularly if a prediction depends on detail, and that'll often be things like, you know, the fate of a contaminant. But for a lot of predictions, it mightn't depend on that detail, and perhaps that all that information for some predictions doesn't really matter that much, and the model, rather than being faced with how do I need to make it more complex to justify the recent investment in all your geophysics, might be, well, I don't really need that information for this prediction, but thanks all the same. Does that not the answer you wanted, is it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Well, again, I'd have to see the case to know more, but ultimately the answer is, what potential does this have to reduce the uncertainty of the prediction that matters? Is it the biggest contributor to uncertainty, or is something else? Now, if it is the biggest contributor, you know, I think there's always a way. What you have measured may not be represented in that model in a picture-perfect way that it exists under the ground, but there will be a way of upscaling it and of designing appropriate upscaling, maybe with synthetic models. There'll always be a way. It may not be the perfect way. Of course, you shouldn't ignore data, but if it's important demonstrably, there will be a way to assimilate it to some degree at least. And being picture perfect in the representation of all those features probably will not be the way. But I'd have to know more about the case before I said anything more, because I may have already said stupid stuff already.
Thanks for that. What advice do you have for reviewers of models, especially reviewers who are thinking about a lot of what you touched on today, but maybe are reviewing models that were done sort of the traditional way?
I didn't get all of that. You're a bit close. I was a bit of an echo or something. Sorry. Can you just say that?
Just wondering what advice you have to be a more effective reviewer of models in light of what you've told us, especially considering that a lot of the models one might be reviewing are done the traditional way.
Yeah, now I reckon that's a real good question. You know, when you look at where are things going wrong, you know, I think you build a model, you review the model, you know, you use the model. The review process, I think, is kind of part of the problem. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have someone check our work by any means. But if there are metrics here, again, so if we're saying, so if someone's reviewing a model, well, that could be the first problem. They're reviewing the model. They should be reviewing the modeling process. So here is the decision I've got to make. Here is the uncertainties I've got to quantify. Firstly, make sure you haven't understated those uncertainties, and perhaps if you haven't assimilated the information as it pertains to that prediction, then you could have improved it, you know, something like that. But at the moment, reviewers are living by weird metrics. You know, review the model. That just doesn't make sense. That shouldn't even be allowed to be a sentence. Review the process by which you've tested this hypothesis should be the basis of the review process. Reviewing a model doesn't make sense, in my opinion.
Maybe you have time for one more question or so?
Oh, no. I can't hear, Keith. Can you come to the microphone so that the rest of us have the benefit of hearing your question?
You're describing it as an act where we have to compromise. So in this case, if I engage in acts of groundwater modeling, have I compromised myself?
What did he say?
If you engage in acts of groundwater modeling, have I compromised myself?
If I've what?
If you engage in acts
Oh.
of groundwater modeling,
Oh.
thereby compromise yourself.
Well, I've committed crimes against humanity, yes, because I've built groundwater models. And perhaps I'll commit them again, but I'm doing my best not to, and I'm willing to confess my sins. So.
Well, I want to thank John for giving a year of his life to getting his message out there. It's a long haul. I don't know how many talks you've given over the past year.
45 to 50, haven't counted them.
Yeah,
all yet.
45 to 50 of these. So I'm guessing the first time around it maybe was not as smooth as this, but by the time you get to the 50th one, you've ironed out most of the kinks, and you're a professional at it.
Well, my voice was a lot better earlier on.
Well, we really do appreciate all of your dedication to the craft and to this past year of giving this talk all around the country, all around the world, I'm assuming. And we want to present you with this plaque acknowledging our gratitude.
Oh,
So,
thank you very much. That's very precious.
Yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate it.